Please, 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 Lord Jesus, save me."
Hearing her screeching those words, pleading in a torrent of terror and tears for Jesus to save her, I remember thinking to myself that I must have been somewhat of a letdown compared to who she was expecting. Still, I thought, it'll be me, not Jesus, who saves you. Sprinting up the gravel pathway to where she knelt, I saw her, slumped against the heavy wooden doors of the church, her two hands clasped around the iron ring that usually opened the entrance, clinging to it like it was the edge of a life raft in a vast of broiling sea. Her dress, which was a sickly shade of purple, had ridden up to show her thick lower limbs, crumpled beneath her at awkward angles and torn all over with abrasions and grazes, where she had struggled and stumbled in her frantic panic back toward the church. As I made my approach, checking around me for any intruder or cause for her obvious panic, she continued to scream. Tears streamed down her face as she wailed and bawled, repeating that holy name over and over again. Clutching at the door handle in that way, she reminded me of images I had seen in books or in movies of women from the Middle Ages, women who, having been persecuted by some baying mob, had hammered on the doors of the church and pleaded for sanctuary. As it turned out, it had been granted, though there should have been no need. Usually, Claudette was the only person on the inside of the church. It was actually odd to see her outside. For almost 3 decades, she had acted as assistant at the sacristy, the building adjacent to the church where our local priest Fearmort lived. For 30 years, she had taken care of the upkeep of the church, organising the flowers, cleaning and polishing the pews, organising any special displays, such as the ones now standing in the grounds for Christmas, and generally attending to the priest's needs at home. She was, for all intents and purposes, a maidservant for both the priest and the church building itself. At almost any hour that the church doors were open, you would find her either inside the drafty old building itself, attending to some duty, or in the sacristy preparing meals or completing the domestic chores for and around the priest. How and why she ended up outside of the church, slumped like a wino against the doors and screaming to heaven for mercy, I had no idea, but the people who had called me were clearly concerned about the screaming and had asked me to hurry up there. It wasn't like I was a regular attendee at the church either. At the time these events took place, Christmas of 2023, I was teaching at the Morton High School. I grew up in Morton, and going from being a teenager in the town to being a teacher at the local high school gave me an insight that seemed to help when establishing a rapport with the kids. I also happened to live about 5 doors down from the church, and since in a town like Morton, where everyone knows everyone, I was a well-established face, I was also promoted at the first sign of trouble from humble school teacher to heroic rescuer of the old and infirm. Why the neighbours had decided to call on me to help Claudette, rather than call the police or indeed go up there to help themselves, I don't know. Perhaps they thought my friendly conversations with her as I passed each day were more than just politeness. Perhaps they assumed we knew each other more closely or were somehow related. Whatever the reason, I was summoned to help, and I gladly answered the call. Had I known quite what I was getting involved with at the time, I may have chosen to ignore that call, or at least pretend that I had not heard it. As a teacher in Morton, you kind of got used to seeing some rather odd things, but this was stranger than most. The sight of this woman, usually so prim and proper, buttoned down and not a little abrasive, in a sodden heap pleading for her life, was unnerving to say the least. It looked particularly out of place because of the Christmas decorations and fairy lights that had been strung up around us. In most scenarios, such decorations would cut through the darkness and frost of the season, offering some subtle glow to warm the scenes as winter tried to impose its will upon the world. Now, though, they looked sour, yellowed and melancholy, throwing over both of us heavy slices of jet-black shadow that was fractured and dappled in places, as if the light were struggling and fighting a losing battle against the dark. Crouching down beside Claudette, I threw my jacket around her to shield her from the cold, and watched as she jumped out of her skin, flinching and cowering at my touch. She had, it seemed, not even noticed my approach, but had entered an almost trance-like state as she recited and repeated her pleas to heaven. She had not expected my hand to touch her. What she had been expecting was only revealed later. Having hoisted Claudette to her feet and bustled her, With some difficulty into the sacristy, I got her seated at the table and made tea, to which I added a nip of whiskey from the decanter that I knew would be on the table. I have never met a priest yet who didn't like a drink. It took a while for Claudette to come back to her senses, and watching the process was like seeing something thaw and melt. Slowly though, the ice and frost of the night's events began to slide away. Her shoulders, which had been rigidly clamped up in a defensive posture, finally began to sink down, and she relaxed at least enough to speak to me. Not that what she said made much sense.
It was the devil,
she said as I considered driving her to the local hospital.
If not the devil, then some demon, one of his minions like the ones in the paintings.
She was referring, I knew, to the luridly graphic painting that adorned the walls on the inside of the church. Having spent many a Sunday in my youth standing in that church, I'd had occasion many times to consider their details. Above, in only the top third of the painting, was heaven, Christ in radiant glory, and angels and seraphim in cool whites and pinks circling in wreaths of cloud. Clearly, however, they were not the main focus of the artist's intentions, because the other two-thirds of the composition was dedicated to scenes of damnation, as wild-eyed and wet-lipped demons, smiling through rows or jagged teeth, writhed and grimaced in fiery pits, clawing up with violent taloned hands toward the scenes of salvation above. Hearing Claudette refer to these paintings so explicitly, I wondered for a moment how many hours she must have spent, alone and thinking in the heavy silence of the old church, staring in contemplation of these faces, those wild ravenous eyes, and those teeth. Perhaps, I thought, such contemplation had a way of playing on the mind, and perhaps it was these ideas that had led her to become so terrified by the shadows moving around and behind the church. Perhaps it was. But Claudette was convinced that it was something far more literal and tangibly real that she was fleeing from.
I'd gone out,
she said,
to attend to the nativity scene. I wanted to make sure all the statues were arranged properly and to redo some of the flowers and the straw and hay we put down. Sometimes the frost and the snow gets at it, and makes it all go a bit rotten, so you have to keep replacing it.
She was referring, I knew, to the nativity scene outside of the church, kept in a specially made grotto intended to look like a stable. It showed the scene of Jesus' birth. Statues, almost life-sized, stood with heads bowed around the central crib. Mary and Joseph as proud parents, shepherds by the side with donkeys and cows, lowing in attendance. The wise men were yet to arrive. They would only be placed in the scene after the Epiphany, and this being Boxing Day, would not be in the picture quite yet. And of course, in the starring role, little baby Jesus in his crib. The statues were surrounded by real hay, flowers and lights in a careful tableau arrangement, and people came every year to see the display and spare a few moments of contemplative prayer. It made perfect sense that it would be Claudette attending to the scene at 7 p.m. on a cold December night.
I was just adjusting some of the statues when I heard it. I've been here a long time and I know what footsteps on the gravel sound like, but this was different. It was more like the sound a dog makes walking on the path when its claws make a sort of click with each step. I couldn't imagine there'd be any dog walkers up here at this hour, so I turned around, and there it was. It had come out from the trees at the side of the path and it had been watching me. As soon as I saw it, I knew. It was just like the paintings inside. It was a demon or...
She trailed off as the tears drowned out the words.
I froze, and for a second it just crouched there, sniffing the air. Its head was like a dog or a wolf, but wrong, like the bones had been put together in the wrong order before the skin was stretched over it, but the eyes were tiny, tiny and white, like they weren't quite formed. It reminded me of when animals are born and they are blind at first, their eyes screwed shut or sealed. They were there, but they were totally white, no pupils, no iris, just white like a golf ball or a pearl. But it was seeing me. Somehow or another, it was watching. How clear the vision was, I don't know, because it kept sniffing, crinkling back its snout, and every time it did, the lips peeled back over these awful, awful fangs. I remember screaming and running back towards the church. I had the keys. I knew I had them, but I couldn't get them out quick enough, and running away, I stumbled over, and I could feel it behind me. I could feel it on me, I was crawling and scraping in the dirt, but I couldn't get any purchase. It was like the gravel was just giving way under my feet, and every time I kicked and fought to move away, it took a step closer. I swear I looked up at the door, that big wooden door of the church, and I could see its shadow on the door, the shadow I was laying in, getting bigger and bigger as it moved forward and forward, and I screamed for God and Jesus to save me. And there was a crack, just a horrible snapping crack, like someone biting down on a rock-hard nut and fracturing their teeth. It had pounced on the statues, jumped on the nativity and just thrashed through it, smashing things and tearing. And I looked up, oh God, I looked up, and it had the baby, the statue of the baby, in its jaws. I don't know how much it could see, but it had picked that shape out, the shape of a child, of an infant. It had picked that shape out and clamped it between its teeth, snapping and cracking. It had tried to chew it, thinking it was flesh, and it had splintered or broken in its mouth. Whether it snapped its teeth or the shards cut its mouth, I don't know, but it fell back, shrank up the path and seemed to retreat back toward the trees. I just screamed, I held on for dear life, and I screamed, and I screamed.
Though I hadn't attended church in years and I had never believed in demons and monsters, the idea of that image, of some dog-faced thing with the statue of baby Jesus clamped within its jaws, made me recoil at the sacrilege. Yet for Claudette, it was the opposite. For her, it was a miracle.
He gave himself for me. Again, he gave himself for me.
She kept saying over and over. I asked if she needed me to stay and was shooed away with news that Father Moore would be back from a function in a few hours. She said she would be fine, but that whatever it was out there needed to be caught and killed. It was a phrase I had been hearing about town a lot in the past few months, the months since the howling started again. Walking out of the church and back toward that gravel path, I saw the tiny face of that plaster statue, the baby that should have been laid in the manger. It was shattered on the floor, cracked and destroyed, if Claudette was to be believed, by some creature from out of a nightmare, a thing that saw the shape of a baby and saw in that outline food. Still, I thought, had the thing not tried to eat that, then Claudette may not have survived. Perhaps, I considered, it wasn't me who saved her after all.